You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 4th of July 2024 on Monocle Radio.
The Conservative Party adopts the brace position as the UK votes. Joe Biden insists that he is running for president and that he can beat Theodore Roosevelt, and Japan expunges the floppy disk. I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests Elizabeth Braw and Sean Kemp will discuss the day's big stories, and we'll hear from Guy Delaunay amid a queue of vexed Balkan holidaymakers. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller, and I am joined today by Elizabeth Braw, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council and author of Goodbye Globalisation, and by Sean Kemp, a political strategist and former advisor to the Liberal Democrats back when they were in government. And that's not all that likely to happen again this time, but we will be discussing what might be again shortly. Sean, first of all, you have recently been attending a live performance by AC/DC, therefore do the rest of us need to shout?
It might be, you might need to shout and I might need to apologise for quite how croaky my voice sounds because, as is always the way, I was drunkenly roaring along to Highway to Hell.
Which in itself does sound like an anthem for at least one political party contesting here in the UK. Elizabeth, as regular listeners will be aware, you have recently been living in Washington, DC. You are now no longer. You are back in London. Have you discovered that the London rental market is as disastrous as everybody says it is?
As disastrous and as absolutely frantic as everybody says it is. I signed, for example, I paid for one short let only to lose it 4 hours later when the landlord sold his property. So that's how frantic it is.
That all sounds terribly functional. Well, things are about to change, however, one way or another, and we will start with today's noteworthy date. July 4th, the day a long-beleaguered and downtrodden people rose up and sloughed off an inept and indifferent Tory government based in London, and it's Independence Day in the United States. Thanks for coming out. Try the veal. I'm here all week, and so forth. Yes, voters across the UK are going to the polls to deliver what is generally anticipated to be a punishment beating of considerable severity to the long-governing Conservative Party. Sean, first of all, we won't hold anybody to any prognostications that they may make, unless, of course, it turns out they're hilariously mistaken. But what scale of massacre are you anticipating?
An extremely significant one. I mean, the truth is, I think that's, I'll give you a number. I think the Conservatives will end up about sort of 110 to 120 seats, which is a complete disaster. But will actually lead to some people going, if that happens, a lot of people go, well, that's not as bad as it could have been.
I know, that's actually at the optimistic end.
Yeah, which is what's extraordinary about this. And partly we have these, what they call these MRP polls, which now are meant to give extremely accurate predictions of what's going to happen in each seat. But they're kind of a developing science. And there have been so many of them in this election, and they've all been so cataclysmic that anything that isn't utter, asteroid hitting the Earth, as the 1997 election was described for the Conservative Party, might feel almost a bit of a letdown, I think, in some people's eyes, because we're all waiting for this big drama. But look, Labour are going to win. They're going to win big. The question is, is it an extinction level event for the Conservative Party or not? I suspect the Conservative Party won't quite go extinct, but are going to get an awful battering.
I mean, Elizabeth, their election campaign has been a strange one, and I think it was always going to be a strange one because they can read the same polls as the rest of us, and they would have understood how difficult this was going to be for them. But in the last few days in particular, it's all been about trying to dissuade people from voting Labour. Was there ever any kind of positive case the Conservatives could have made at this point? There's been very little from them of, here's what we've done really well and here's what we could do more of.
There was never a coherent message, was there? A coherent positive message. And frankly, this campaign from the Conservatives has seemed rather chaotic since the beginning. And I remember the first couple of days of the campaign when the Tories put out this proposal about national service. And I discovered, to my great surprise, that something that I had written 5 years ago, namely a proposal for national service, had just been nicked by them without so much as a friendly.
I mean, Elizabeth, they haven't lost yet. You could be blamed by future generations of British youth for giving them the idea.
I wasn't sure whether I should complain that nobody had been in touch to say that they were going to use this proposal. But anyway, I think it was an indication of how frantic and frankly shambolic the campaign strategy was that they put out. This proposal was that when they put it out was poorly thought through and then didn't go very well, simply because it seemed to be a sort of Hail Mary pass, hastily assembled and sent it out into the world.
I mean, Sean, you have, of course, worked on general election campaigns in this country, and I'm just wondering how often you found yourself watching this one through balled-up fists, because, things like the Prime Minister leaving the D-Day commemorations early, launching the campaign in a district of Belfast named after the Titanic, several other missteps that almost looked deliberate. What have you made? I mean, how do things like that happen, I guess, is the better question.
Well, I always have an element of sympathy, because there's always these things that people go, oh, what idiots, how could they miss that? And some of them I think are unfair. Like, Rishi Sunak was photographed on a plane and there was an exit sign in the background and people went, what a terrible gaffe. It's like, well, you're even going to let him do a press conference and talk on the plane and have photos or not. And if you're going to let him do it, there's going to be an exit sign. So there's a little bit of like, he could have rescued a drowning puppy and people would have said, well, this is terrible because we're going to go on a Savage Cats or something. It's like there was someone. The bits that had me in utter despair were the launch in the rain, which I do not understand. And they briefed afterwards, someone told the papers, well, we didn't want him to look like he was scared. And it's like, well, like he wants to prove he's not scared of rain. No one wants to be rained on. It's fine. Like, no one would have watched that if he'd done that announcement indoors and gone, what's wrong with you? You don't want to, you're scared of rain. It was bizarre. The Titanic one, I thought was a bit mean in a way. Like, if you're going to go to Belfast, like, that's the big area of revitalisation of it. The D-Day one is the most inexplicable thing. It is staggering. And that is the one where, and there's always 20/20 hindsight in these things. There's always is. I cannot understand for the life of me how that got through. And by all accounts, it was discussed by a group of them, and none of them raised it as a problem. That was baffling. And that and the rain are the two ones, from my sort of angle of being a former sort of comms advisor, with my comms hat on, me and colleagues just sat there just thinking, I cannot believe what I'm watching. It was extraordinary.
I mean, for you, Elizabeth, watching this as a non-British person, how perplexing have you found it? How different is this to, for example, a Swedish general election?
Well, bear in mind, I've been an expat now for many decades, but that gives me the vantage point of having experienced elections in many countries. So I think it's always fascinating to watch election campaigns in first-past-the-post systems, because you've got this sort of contrary or adversarial nature between in the campaigns between the two main parties. So that's always the case. Whereas in proportional representation countries, you have more variations and more discussion around, what groupings might be able to form a coalition government after the election. But what is the most perplexing, I think, in this general election campaign in the UK is how disunited the Tories are. They don't even pretend to be a united party, and several candidates don't even seem to pretend to be making a big effort to win, and that is frankly so. It's perplexing and a sign of, I think, the desperate nature of the Tory party, the desperate state of affairs in the Tory party at the moment. I
mean, it has all been somewhat evocative, Sean, of the closing scene of Reservoir Dogs or possibly Blazing Saddles, but there is among those hoping to see the back of the Tory party, which does seem to be like a hefty majority of the voting public. There's also an amount of wishful thinking, and as a former Liberal Democrat operative yourself, you'll be familiar with the focus of some of the wishful thinking, this idea that the Tories might actually get beaten into third place and that Sir Ed Davey could become leader of His Majesty's loyal opposition. Do you rate that as a prospect?
How likely do I think? I don't think it's that likely, although there are opinion polls that point in that direction. I remember working for the Lib Dems in 2015, by the way, when we got absolutely smashed in an election, and we kept on telling ourselves, well, the polls must be a bit wrong. It can't possibly be that bad. Sometimes it is that bad. I suspect it's unlikely. I suspect, and not wishing to be disloyal to the Lib Dems and Ed, who ran a cracking campaign, I'm not sure they would want to be the opposition party. Firstly, I'm not sure that would necessarily be good for democracy. But also, they've campaigned very narrowly. They've campaigned on things like sewage, on social care, and a few other things. I think the idea that Ed Davey and the Lib Dems are suddenly standing up and asking 6 questions on different topics on PMQs and holding the government to account across the whole economy is the last thing they want. They want to be opportunistically grabbing issues and then running away and hiding again. So I'm not sure I'd want it if I were them.
Elizabeth, again, we're proceeding on the assumption that the polls are broadly correct and that the United Kingdom will have a new Prime Minister this time tomorrow and a new party in power. Again, looking at it from abroad, do you think this will cause the world to look at the United Kingdom in a different way than it might have over the last 8 years in particular, during which the UK does appear to have been having some sort of prolonged nervous breakdown?
What is different this time is that so many countries are having a nervous breakdown, and so the UK is looking pretty good. It's going to be, whoever wins, it's going to be a civilized government, and it's not going to be some sort of radical change, and it's going to be a government that, well, assuming Labour wins, and I think we should discount options other than the Conservatives or Labour winning, but. What the outcome will be is that the UK will be a stable country, a reliable ally, a country that others can count on. And if you look at the turmoil in certain other countries at the moment, the UK is actually looking pretty good. And we only need to compare this country to France, where you're seeing a pretty uncertain future. And the problem is that the sensible, moderate, reasonable leaders that might have turned up in various other countries, they don't really exist anymore, or at the moment, I should say. So that makes the UK actually look like a beacon of stability for a change.
which is something of a turn-up, all things considered. But we should look at the likely vanquished, Sean, because that's going to be quite the psychodrama in coming weeks. If it turns out the Tories have been beaten as badly as everyone assumes they have, there will obviously be a new leader. I mean, Sunak may not even keep his seat, which I suspect would be rather a relief to him, frankly. But the bookies' favourites for a new leader are an assortment of Kemi Badenoch, Tom Tugendhat, Priti Patel, Penny Mordaunt. Again, not all of them might get re-elected.
He's going to be struggling to keep her seat. So
indeed,
that's the first task.
But there will. It strikes me that there will be an essential struggle for the Tory party between: do we pivot back to being the party of stolid, phlegmatic, centre-right reasonableness, or do they go full Yahoo?
Well, I think unless the Conservative Party do what I would strongly encourage them to do, which is to change the rules around their leadership election so that only MPs can vote for who the leader of the party should be, then, Yahoo away, because that's what will happen. Is the rules of the Conservative Party mean that ultimately it goes to a vote of the membership, and he's going to stitch it up, and the person who gets the most MP nominations becomes just automatic leader. It will go to vote of the membership, and memberships are not great in all parties historically at choosing people who are going to naturally appeal to the middle ground voter, because they're made up, because they're party members, and party members are not, frankly, normal, and they're certainly not middle ground. So I suspect it will be, my best guess would it would be someone who would be on the more what you'd perceive as being of the right wing of the party. And then that, I think, is going to be a challenge, because I think the Conservative Party's got so obsessed by, understandably so, what reform could do to them by attacking them from the right. They've kind of forgotten about that big old chunk of the country that doesn't sit on that part of the spectrum. And I think it's going to be a few more years of them going down that rabbit hole.
Well, we have that to look forward to, and we will, of course, be covering the results in detail across all our shows tomorrow. But let's now turn from the Independence Election Day in the United Kingdom to the Guy Fawkes Day election in the United States. Do your own jokes about the date on which a cabal of fanatical hotheads attempted to bring down the established order through debatably legal and ethical means, etc. Within the last 24 hours, reports from inside the White House suggest that President Joe Biden is determined to see the contest through. despite increasing clamour to the effect that he shouldn't, and perhaps should stand aside in favour of someone who cannot recall marvelling at the first transistor radio. The first transistor radio was 1954. I checked. First commercially available, that is. It is quite possible that the young Joe Biden gazed in awe upon one. Elizabeth, is fundamentally Joe Biden too old for this?
He is, and as of today, 80% of Americans think he's too old, and that is a terrible indictment. So not only does he have to win over those who typically vote Republican, he also has to now win over those who think he's too old. And Andrew, this is a tragedy because he has been a good president and has stabilized America. Restored its reputation globally, and he has made some mistakes, but who doesn't make mistakes? But he could have said, I will serve for one term, then I will hand over the baton to a younger candidate who can stand for president on behalf of the Democratic Party. Instead, he chose to run again. And I lay the blame at the feet of his advisors, who should have told him that it is not a good idea. All politicians have a big ego, and all politicians like to think they can do something that others cannot. It is the responsibility of the advisors to set the record straight in the mind of the candidate or the politician, and that's what his advisors did not do. And the reason they didn't do that is that the sort of people he employs as advisors, even at the highest level, are staffer types who have served him as advisors for a very long time. They don't have an independent platform, and as a result, they owe their careers to him, and they have the staffer mentality. And with that mentality, you struggle to tell the truth to the principal you work for.
Well, especially if you would, Sean, be advising yourself right out of a job. But I do wonder again. And I obviously defer to your expertise as a comms expert on this front. What would be the argument? I guess there's an obvious argument against this, but it struck me that if after the debate shambles, and it was a shambles, what if a couple of days later they just said, OK, that was a disaster. He was ill. He was jet lagged. These things happen. We will right now do a 2-hour-long Ask Me Anything press conference, because that surely would settle it. If he came through that, then OK, fine. And if he doesn't come through that, then OK, this is over. He's got to go.
Well, I can give you one very good reason why they suspect they didn't do that, because they just thought it'd be another disaster. You could give that a go. I mean, it'd obviously be a slightly desperate roll of the dice, but that debate called for a desperate roll of the dice. But I think the truth is they wouldn't take that gamble again, because exactly the same result would happen. The problem with that debate is, I agree entirely that the advisors should already have said, just this is not tenable. Even before the debate, it was looking untenable. After the debate, when you basically have a performance which meant, no, I watched that and I'm saying, is this someone I would trust to babysit my toddler? No. It's genuinely not. It's just not someone who I think can concentrate on something important for a long period of time, is what you come away with that impression. Once people have formed that impression, it's been almost confirmed to them, you're done. There isn't a comeback from that, I'm afraid. I really don't think there is.
But on the subject of just picking up on Elizabeth's thing about what an advisor should say to the principal at this point, how do you persuade somebody that their time is up? Because Elizabeth's right as well. Nobody wants to hear that, especially not somebody who has the ego and the drive and the obstinacy necessary to rise to presidency of the United States and has waited a long time to get there.
It's hard because it's someone you've got a personal connection to. It's someone your job relies on as well. You've got a personal connection to. And at some point, you have to turn around and say, I'm sorry, but you're not doing a good enough job, or you're dragging us down or whatever. That is difficult. When the conversation is partly and because of your age and because you're not giving the impression that you're as on it and mentally as capable of doing this job as you once were, it's an extraordinarily hard conversation to have. And the truth is, unless you have very strong-willed people, they'll tend to chicken out of it. And I don't know if that's what's happened, but it very much looks like that's what's happened.
Elizabeth, if he is going to go, and this does seem unlikely at the moment, there then arises a subsidiary question, which does he say, I will serve out my term and it's up to the party to choose a successor at the convention, or does he go now and give Vice President Kamala Harris the advantages of incumbency?
I think he would serve to the end, if only because Kamala Harris would do herself no favors as president of the United States. She is already so desperately unpopular that she would not convince anybody. And in fact, by being more visible as president of the United States, she would convince even more people not to vote for her. And this is the other tragedy of the Biden campaign, that he doesn't even have a running mate who can compliment him and back him up, and who would allow people to say, well, he's getting on, but at least he has a running mate whom I trust and who will be able to steer the ship. And if the good Lord were to call him home, then this running mate would be able, or the vice president would be able to take over, and the country would be in good hands. She is not that person, and that is the other tragedy of his campaign. So he will, I think, for selfish reasons, serve out his term. But even if he wanted to do her a favour, it would turn out not to be a favour if he were to step down if he were to step down and let her govern until January.
I mean, you can imagine, Sean, one of the arguments that Biden and his camp are advocating, which is that I can beat Donald Trump. I did it. Therefore, I can do it again. And the question is obviously then going to come up, if you don't think I can, then who can? And if it isn't Kamala Harris, who do the Democrats have who does beat Donald Trump?
Well, I think that's the problem. I'm not actually sure they do have anyone who can beat Donald Trump. I know it sounds ridiculous. I think in a weird way, Biden was almost the only person who had the sort of, people can feel free to correct me, but I sort of feel like he was the only one of this weird mix of having been around such a long time, being seen as kind of a unifying, quite sensible figure. He occupied a kind of sweet spot, and his kind of avuncular nature. I think people felt he was a sort of bulwark against what they would see as maybe the more sort of lefty edge of the Democrat Party and so on. He occupies almost a sort of unique position in the Democrat Party to be able to be that person who could beat Donald Trump, which is why he managed it last time. And I think it's partly why the party's been, so desperate to have him be the candidate this time, because they know he's probably the only figure who just sits at that little spot on the Venn diagram of everything they need, who can actually pull it off over Donald Trump. I'm not sure there is anyone else who could beat Trump. I just think it might be in the better long-term interest of the Democrat Party to just pick someone else and actually have someone go out and make the case of their party and just be a better communicator than he will be.
Well, on that happy thought, to Japan, which is today declaring victory in its war upon floppy disks. The country's digital minister, Taro Kono, to be clear, a flesh and blood human, not the AI simulacra his title may suggest, has made good on a promise to expunge the once ubiquitous, long redundant storage devices from all Japanese government systems. Japan, it turns out, is surprisingly laggardly on this front. Not only were floppy disks still in use until basically right now, some government departments still maintain fax machines. Ask your parents. Elizabeth, I know from having written a story about this a while ago that the US Air Force only retired floppy disks from its nuclear missile silos in 2019. But interestingly, they advocated for that, some nuclear boffins I spoke to, because they said no one can hack a floppy disk.
That's right, and this is the paradox of modern technology, that the more sophisticated the technology becomes and the more ubiquitous and connected it becomes, the more vulnerable we are to hacking attacks and other digitally based attacks by hostile states and indeed by criminals. So the best protection you have against hacking attacks and the like is to be as technologically unsophisticated as possible, and so the people who use cash will, I think, be vindicated at some point. I only use Apple Pay, but credit to those who stick with cash.
But this is, of course, and this is a timely observation, Sean, also the argument for having elections conducted with pencils and paper and counted manually.
It is, and I think it's an interesting point there about the more ubiquitous the technology gets. I think I was thinking back to when I worked in Downing Street, and we had BlackBerries long after everyone else was on iPhones, partly because they were meant to be more secure. And then they introduced a little sort of credit card sort of thing you had to have about your person as well, so that if your BlackBerry is stolen, it would automatically stop working. And then we had to all be told you weren't allowed just to sellotape the two things together. We were really bored of these. So there's always this. You do get these odd attachments, like pagers in the NHS is a famous example. I think about 5 years ago, 1 in 10 of the pagers in use in the entire world are used in the NHS in the UK.
The NHS went back to recording blood tests on paper rather than computers after recent cyber attacks.
Yeah.
Because again, you can't hack a piece of paper.
And when Norsk Hydro was hacked in a ransomware attack a few years ago, they were able to keep operations going because they had a couple of older employees who knew how to run operations basically with pen and paper. But when Colonial Pipeline was hacked a couple of years ago, they didn't have any such employees anymore, so they had to shut down the system. So that should tell every company, pay attention to your older employees. Don't ease them out the door. Actually, keep them on for as long as you can, and even after they retire.
Music to my ears, Elizabeth.
Thank you, President Biden.
I did want to ask you each in turn, in closing, is there any item of arcane technology, you first, Sean, which they will need to prize from your cold, dead hands? For me, the iPod Classic. I was
going to say exactly the same thing.
I kept going as long as I possibly could. I still have an iPod Touch, which, to be honest, I kind of hate, but it's the nearest thing.
I think losing my iPod, I nearly went into mourning. Because I know there's all these reasons why streaming is wonderful and so on, but it's almost too much choice. Yeah, I feel like I've lost my connection to my music collection, and I'm always listening to something else. I would please Apple, please just let me have an iPod back.
I could not possibly agree more. Elizabeth, are you still using floppy disks?
No, but I use CDs, and for classical music, CDs are the best. Spotify doesn't hold a candle to the old CD.
Okay, well, on that retrograde Luddite note, Sean Kemp and Elizabeth Braw, thank you both for joining us today. And finally, on today's show, when Croatia joined the Schengen area at the start of last year, regular travellers heaved a sigh of relief. Membership of the borderless zone meant the end of an unwelcome summer ritual, the long queues at the crossings with Slovenia, as much of Middle Europe headed to the Croatian coast. But now travellers are bracing for the worst because Slovenia's reimposed border checks on security grounds. Monocle's man in Ljubljana, Guy Delorne, is among the unpleased.
Last summer, the promise of border-free travel with our neighbours briefly bloomed into reality. Planning a trip to the Croatian coast became a lot less complicated. We didn't have to check traffic cameras or hope we'd chosen the least crowded crossing point, and there was no need to pack provisions for the inevitable hours-long queue sandwiched between German-registered campervans. Instead, we cruised serenely through what used to be no man's land between Slovenia and Croatia. The booths formerly occupied by sullen border police were shuttered. Croatia's membership of the Schengen area made them as redundant as the deserted currency exchange offices and the long-abandoned duty-free shops. I'm tempted to say that I don't have the words to explain how good it felt, but I wouldn't be much of a journalist if I didn't have a crack. So I can reveal that it was like enjoying the freedom of surfing in board shorts after years of being stuck inside a 4mm wetsuit. After all, we go on holiday to escape the grind, not to endure the crushing monotony of an endless traffic queue. Vodnjan was one of the places I visited after Croatia joined Schengen. It's a charming small town just a few kilometres inland from the Istrian coast. It has old stone houses, a couple of superb neighbourhood restaurants, and family-owned olive groves producing some of the world's best extra virgin oil. Not a bad destination, in other words. My friend Mateusz has a place there. He and his wife Nina are both architects. They've been working to restore some of the dwellings left unoccupied by Vodnjan's dwindling population. That means regular trips between Istria and their home in Ljubljana. And just like me, Mateusz was immensely relieved that delays inflicted by border officials would no longer blight the journey. It was a really nice change, he told me. Before Schengen, there were always queues on the border. Sometimes we had to wait for hours to get through, and that was just for a basic control. Often, they wouldn't even look at our travel documents. Alas, the honeymoon period didn't last long. Within months of Schengen accession, the complaints from Slovenia and Italy started. They blamed Croatia for an increase in the number of people arriving via the so-called Balkan route for migration. Formal checkpoints didn't make an immediate comeback, but police stepped up patrols, and there were rumblings of stricter measures if Croatia proved unable to secure the Schengen border. It was almost as if the authorities had been more comfortable when the borders were in place, and they were looking for an excuse to restore them. That duly arrived last October. Italy swiftly declared that events in Israel and Gaza had increased the risk of terrorists mingling with other people travelling along the Balkan route. As a result, it was reintroducing temporary border checks with Slovenia. The government in Ljubljana responded by introducing controls of its own at its frontiers with Hungary and Croatia. On the other hand, Austria didn't have to change anything. Its supposedly temporary border controls with Slovenia started in 2015, when traffic along the Balkan route was at its height. Despite repeated protests from its neighbours, those emergency measures have never been lifted. Mateusz has come on the receiving end of that as well. He lived in Vienna with his family for several years after Austria reintroduced its border checks. You could understand it if they were controlling the movement of the people, he says, but often it just seems like a bureaucratic obstacle because the checks are so perfunctory. In fairness, the border authorities probably aren't looking for white men with Slovenian identity cards, but the people they are looking for aren't daft enough to drive through the main border crossings. There are regular reports of police intercepting people smugglers and occasional accidents following high-speed chases. Going across unmarked green borders is not without hazards or hardships, but it remains the preferred option for many. Some may be using the many smaller and often unmanned checkpoints. Italy, Slovenia and Croatia had all been making noises about ensuring that the Schengen regime would be restored in time for the all-important summer season. That accounts for the majority of Croatia's tourist income, and inbound arrivals generate about a fifth of the country's GDP. The proposal was to increase joint border patrols at the spots most likely to be favoured by people smugglers. That would have allowed the border checkpoints to fade back into history. But last month, Slovenia confirmed it would extend the supposedly temporary controls until the end of the year, and Croatians would be forgiven for wondering why they jumped through all the hoops required to join the Schengen area. I'm not in a hurry to see if the queues will return to their previous lengths, and I'm certainly not going to attempt a crossing at peak times between Friday and Sunday, or if I do, I'll make sure I'm on a bicycle. There's no aircon, and luggage capacity is limited, but those on two wheels do at least go straight to the front of the queue. For Monocle, somewhere between Slovenia and Croatia, I'm Guy Delaunay.
And that was Guy Delaunay reporting from the liminal space between Croatia and Slovenia. That is all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Sean Kemp and Elizabeth Braw. The show was produced by Henry Rees Sheridan and researched by Sana Jumani and Gunnar Gronlid. Our sound engineer was Sarah Nichol. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily returns at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.